Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Welcome to everybody. And again, I am just going to, once again, I'm going to post the two links. This is the link to last week's series of sources, and this should be the link to the second set of sources, although I've modified it slightly from those two links that I've just posted, and I will share it on the screen with you as well. I also am going to ask you if you can and have the ability to turn on your video. It is helpful to me because then I get to see everybody, even as I share my screen. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. As I share my screen, I still get to see you all on my second screen, so we're good. And okay. So actually, I'm going to start with we're going to actually be starting from the source pages that we left off with last week, which is this one. Again, the link is in the chat, but I want to start with the basic question that many of you put in the chat last week, and I saw that there were multiple comments to the same issue, and it really was our topic for kind of to introduce our conversation today, which is the authorship of Kohelet. It's hard to talk about a book without addressing the question of who wrote it, when was it written, why was it written, etc. So the problem with Kohelet is threefold. Number one, and this is clear from the text itself, the text itself identifies its authorship as Shlomo HaMelech, or makes claim to the authorship of King Solomon, does so in a number of places. Divrei Kohelet ben David Melech b'Yushalayim, David, Kohelet, son of David, king in Yerushalayim. David only has one son who's king in Yerushalayim. Similarly, in verse 12, Ani Kohelet, Hayiti Melech Yisrael b'Yushalayim. I, Kohelet, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. It's the second time he mentions this reference. And towards the end of the book as well. And so the book itself lays claim to the authorship or association with King Solomon. Now, it is also true that there are words, phrases, syntax, concepts that are very late. Influence of Aramaic, influence of Persian, influence of grammar and syntax and words that are structured around the Hebrew that was common in the time of the Second Temple, and not at all common in Tanakh, which makes Kohelet sound very different from other books in Tanakh. It's also true that Kohelet seems to have a kind of introductory, a prologue that is separate from the rest of the book. It's that prologue we're going to look at today. He speaks of Kohelet in third person, Divrei Kohelet. And then in verse 12, he starts Ani Kohelet. All right, so there's a difference between I am Kohelet and the words of Kohelet. And similarly, in the very last chapter, and I think some of you pointed this out, there is a moment in the book in which there is a kind of an epilogue. Bikesh Kohelet limtzod divrei chefetz. Kohelet sought. Kohelet in the third person. And so the question becomes the authorship of the book and its integrity as a text. Add to the complexity around the question of whether it's associated with King Solomon or associated with kind of an authorship in Second Temple period is the fact that it's in Tanakh. And Chazal were very clear that there was a certain moment in history at the beginning of the Second Temple period, more or less coinciding with the end of prophecy, in which Chazal went through a painstaking analysis of Tanakh and a determination, particularly during the time of Yavne, early generations of Yavne, and the end of the period of the Mishnah, of the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the beginning of the period of the Mishnah, in which they canonized Tanakh. And so the notion of a book from much later in the period of, let's say, Hellenism, or in the period of post-prophecy, to be included in Tanakh is very complicated. And from my perspective, I think outside of the comfort zone that I learned in the Beis Medrash under Rav Medan. So what I wanted to share with you is the fact that we do have this notion. Gemara Baba Batra says very clearly that there were 3 stages to the authorship of Tanakh. There are books written by the prophets themselves. Yirmiyahu wrote his book. He wrote the book of Kings. He wrote the book of Echa, says the Gemara. Hizkiyahu and his scholars wrote the book of Yeshayahu. What does that mean? Does it mean that Yeshayahu didn't write his own book? Hizkiyahu wrote the book of Yeshayahu, or Mishlei, written by King Solomon. Mishlei is certainly written by King Solomon. Mishlei Shlomo. So how does the Gemara assert that Hizkiyahu wrote the book of Mishlei, or Shir Hashirim, or Kohelet? Here, the Gemara is saying that Hizkiyahu, towards the end of the First Temple period, composed the book of Kohelet, when Kohelet itself, Shir Hashirim itself, Mishlei, all 3 of these are the books of Shlomo. And then the Gemara goes on to say that the men of the Great Assembly, which is essentially the beginning of the transition period between First Temple and Second Temple, beginning of the Second Temple period up to more or less the beginning, first generations of the Mishnah, they composed the books of Yechezkel and Treasar and Daniel and Esther. But these are books written by prophets much earlier. Yechezkel was written by Yechezkel. Treasar was written by the individual prophets involved. So the understanding that we have from this Gemara is that Tanakh goes through a series of steps. There's an initial authorship, but there was a major effort in the days of Hizkiyahu to take the books of Tanakh that existed up until that point and to work them through, to edit them, to put them into a format, to preserve them, to give them a kind of a flow to them. We have no information as to what was added in the time of Hizkiyahu. Doesn't matter, because Hizkiyahu was still time of Nevi'im, but there is this editing process that they go through, stage 2. And then there's a third stage of the Anshe Knesset Agdola that Tanakh also undergoes, including, in that context, a third stage of editing and collating and putting together information, to the point where the canonization of the Bible, the Tanakh that we have, with all 24 books of it, including the book of Divrei Hayamim, are essentially pulled together, given the stamp of the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and that really closes the book on Tanakh. So academics, certainly in the world of sort of modern scholarship, there is an attempt to try to identify different authors to different parts of even the single book, and to place books like Kohelet and Daniel in a much later time period. We finished studying Sefer Daniel at a different time last year. But from my perspective, the book lays claim to an association with Shlomo HaMelech. Chazal certainly saw Shlomo as the foundation of the book, but later additions and later editing of Hizkiyahu and Anshe Knesset Agdola are certainly relevant, which would help explain why some parts of the book are kind of third person. These are the words of Kohelet, and other parts of the book are I Kohelet. Right? There's this kind of this back and forth, certainly the beginning and the end, the prologue and the epilogue, primarily because, like many books of Tanakh, there is this process of going through a series of steps in the journey. And so that's the perspective that I'm going to take as we go through this Sefer. That's the approach that I learned from Rav Medan. And for those who are more comfortable with the suggestion that Kohelet was written or edited during the time of the Hellenistic period, if that's your thing, that's fine. I don't have really any reason to challenge it, other than it would go against my understanding of the canon of Tanakh and the prophetic stamp of approval that every book of Tanakh has. But in all cases, the books of Tanakh, the Sefer Kohelet, certainly makes the claim and Chazal support the claim that it has an association with King Solomon. And so from a perspective of understanding the book, and this is the main piece, from a perspective of understanding the book, I think it's critical that we start from the perspective of the integrity that the book creates, which is, I, Kohelet, these are my words to search, to understand, to explore the world, and Kohelet is Ben David, Melech Yerushalayim. How does Kohelet, the name Kohelet, come to be associated with Shlomo HaMelech? So there, Chazal already point to this verse in Sefer Melachim Aleph, Book of Kings, and this verse states that Shlomo HaMelech gathered Israel together. Az yakel Shlomo ziknei Yisrael. Solomon, I don't know what convoke means. The translations are all from alatorah.org. Somebody asked me last week where the translations are from. I work exclusively off this website because it gives me the Hebrew and English together. I can't vouch for how good the translation is. It's one of these open source translations, but at least it gives us a start. So I'm not sure what convoke means, but kahel, lahakil, means to gather together. Gathered together or convened all the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, etc. And the context of this verse is Elamelech Shlomo Yerushalayim, to Solomon in Yerushalayim, Le'alot et Aron Brit Hashem Me'ir David, to bring the ark from Ir David, from the city of David, to the temple that Shlomo had just started or just built. Shlomo built the temple in chapters 6 and 7 of the Book of Kings. In chapter 8, he begins the dedication ceremony of the temple itself. And that's the moment that Shlomo gathers together all of the elders of Israel in an extraordinary gathering for the purpose of building or inaugurating the temple, I should say. So based on that reference, Yakel Shlomo, Chazal make the assertion that Kohelet and Shlomo is the same person. Why was he called Kohelet if his name was Solomon? Because his words were said behakel, in a kind of an assembly. His words were spoken in an assembly, in a public gathering. His words of wisdom, his words, his insights. Shlomo gathered everybody together in this format. Therefore, and the Gemara quotes this verse, Az Yakel Shlomo. FYI, we know that Shlomo has at least two names, and Chazal here attribute to Shlomo a third. He's named Yedidyah. That's the name he's given when he's born in the book of Shmuel Bet, by the Malach, by the angel, or by the Navi. It's unclear. He's called Shlomo. Right? That's the name that David gives him. And according to this tradition, he also goes by Kohelet, although Kohelet, I think, is more of a description rather than a name. Kohelet, Rashi says, Al Shem Shekihel Chochmot Harbeh, because he gathered much wisdom, says Rashi. All three of these interpretations, more or less focusing around the notion of the collection, the gathering, whether it's a gathering of people or a gathering of wisdom. Here, Shlomo is gathering the people in the Book of Kings at the dedication of the temple, and Rashi attributes it to the notion of Kihel Chochmot Harbeh. He gathered much wisdom. So he's gathering people together, or he's gathering wisdom, but that's essentially the word kahal. Just as an FYI, and I found this in Wikipedia, I found it in Merriam-Webster.com, fascinating description of the word Ecclesiastes. We will refer to the book exclusively as Kohelet. I can't even pronounce this, the English or Greek or Latin form of the book, but nonetheless, it is interesting to know where this name comes from. Most of the English or Latin names of the books of Tanakh connect in some way to the book itself. Kings is Malachim, Shmuel is Samuel. The books of Chumash in their English or the Greek names are a little bit trickier. Deuteronomy, which comes from the second review, etc. But Leviticus, of course, comes from the word Levi or Vayikra or Sefer HaKohanim. Here it says that the word Ecclesiastes comes from the late Latin, borrowed from the Greek, which means, and here's the key, participant in an assembly of citizens. So what they've done essentially is taken this translation of Kohelet as kihel, to gather together many people to hold a public assembly, to be a member of an assembly, and they've given that as the English name of the text, which is more or less what Chazal understood the name Kohelet to represent, that he gathered together either the people, or he gathered the wisdom, or maybe both. He gathered the people to express his wisdom and to share his wisdom with them. There is one very fascinating carryover from this description of the name of the book, and that is that Rav Medan postulates the idea that the reason we read Kohelet on Sukkot is because of the biblical mitzvah of Hakel. It's a biblical mitzvah of Hakel every 7 years on Chag Sukkot to publicly gather the people together for the king to read the people to read to the people books of the Torah, etc. And from that mitzvah of Hakel, Rav Medan suggests that maybe that's where the reference of Kohelet came from. That was a gathering, or maybe it was even a text that was publicly read in those arenas. Rav Yoel ben Nun's suggestion is that it comes from this choir of voices, or multiple voices that we talked about last week, kind of a makela. But nonetheless, either way, it comes to the same point, which is that we are going to work off the assumption, the association, that Kohelet is connected to King Solomon, whether he wrote parts of it, and it was transmitted orally for many years until Chizkiyahu and his colleagues wrote them down, which seems to be the reference to this Gemara, that it was wisdom that was transmitted orally, a kind of a masoret, until it was ultimately committed to writing in the days of Chizkiyahu, and then later on edited in the days of Anshe Knesset Agdola. That would kind of answer the question of why it has these multiple layers, both in the text as well as in the language. For our purposes, all of these associations point to Shlomo HaMelech, and we are going to spend a great deal of time kind of navigating around the world of Shlomo to understand the text. Because ultimately, if the text makes claim to Shlomo HaMelech, then to understand the text, we need to understand its authorship or its original form, and then an association with King Solomon. All right, that more or less is where we had left off last week, and where we were going to pick up today. And so that brings us to the next two questions, which is we're going to start the introduction to the Sefer as well. But before I do that, I think it's valuable to kind of take a giant leap back and ask the question, is there a bird's eye view of what are the major themes of the book? What are the major subjects that Sefer Kohelet struggles with? And what's fascinating is that the easiest way to identify that, because there's so many different voices and so many different variables, and we'll see them in detail, is to kind of do a basic search. What word or concept appears in the book of Kohelet more than any other, over and over and over again? What word, phrase, concept, struggle, issue is at the core of whatever it is that Kohelet is struggling with? And if we do that exercise, and I'm not going to take you through the textual analysis of it, but if we do that exercise, Roach is part of it. But there are actually two words, for example, there's three concepts, but there's two words that appear over and over and over again, more times than any other. And I'll show you what they are. It's very easy to find them. Which Havalim appears only a handful of times, much more. I would argue these words that appear somewhere in the vicinity between 50 to 60 times in the course of the text. By my calculation, one of them appears 68 times, the other one appears 46 times. That's way more than the phrase Haval Havalim. The words in question are, and I will show them to you. You actually have them on the source page. If I scroll down, I gave you a simple, this is a database search. Database search threw in the word Tov. So this is every reference in the book of Kohelet to the word Tov. Now, I apologize again. Somebody asked me about translations. We will get to the text as we study the text itself, literally word by word. We will work with the translations side by side. For my purpose right now, I didn't want to put the translations because I wanted you to see this all on one page. This is, and I'm going to scroll out so you can see it, 52 verses, but if I include all the references, all the verses that include more than one instance where the word Tov appears, there are in fact something like 68 different places in the book where the book mentions the word Tov. Now, would it surprise anybody to find an almost equal number of references to the word Ra? Right. So if I go down to the next page, there are 39 different verses in Kohelet when he mentions the word Ra. And if I include the doubles, there are something like 46 different references to the word Ra. So that should not surprise anybody because Tov and Ra is essentially correct. And Ra includes Ruach. Tov and Ra essentially refer to the quest for understanding. If the quest of Shlomo HaMelech, if the quest of Kohelet is to understand the world, well, that in the language of Tanakh is to understand Tov and Ra. That more or less encompasses everything that we know about the world, divides up into that which is Tov and that which is Ra, and now figure out how to navigate between them. But the fact that Kohelet is exactly that quest, struggle, trying to understand the world through the eyes of a kind of a giant laboratory of personal experience, it's no shock that the two key words in this quest are Tov and Ra. Now, there's a third element. The third element is a little harder to identify because it doesn't come from a word, but it comes from a phrase. But I will already kind of give you a glimpse into one of the things that we will explore in detail, which is the Kohelet, when any other book in Tanakh struggles with the question of the shadow of death that looms over life and what purpose and meaning life has in the context of the existence of death as a kind of an equalizer to all of the efforts of accomplishment in the world. Now, to prove that at this hang on one second. To prove that at this juncture would take me too much time, just for now, take it at my word. I will prove it to you as we go through the book. But if I look at these two ideas, that in the broadest sense of the term, before we get into the text, in the broadest sense of the term, the two main themes that will permeate the book from beginning to end, on the one hand, the meaning of life and death, in particular, the role of death as a kind of casts a shadow over all of the accomplishments of life. On the other hand, the meaning of good and evil, Tov and Ra, good and bad, in the broadest sense of the term. It already gives me a clue as to where this book is going to lead me. Because there's only one place in Tanakh where I have two anchor points. One is Tov and Ra, and the other is life and death. And that's the two trees of Gan Eden. That the two trees of the Garden of Eden are the tree of Eitz HaDa'at Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and the tree of life, from which Adam is banished because he took of the tree of knowledge. So suddenly there is a kind of a key that opens up to, as we begin to explore the text itself, to understanding, okay, where's he going with all of this? There's something about the story that's very earliest philosophical kind of address in the Torah itself to the meaning of life and death and existence and creation, going all the way back to Gan Eden, and why Solomon is obsessed with that moment in time, those are questions we will have to explore, and we will explore as we begin, at this point, to begin to look at the text itself. Somebody had a quick question. I'm going to take that question, and then we're going to jump into the text.
Yeah, it's actually a comment. And first, thank you very much. It's basically very pessimistic approach.
So
it's very dark and pessimistic approach. Looking at life, only good and bad, and that's all.
Right. So let me clarify what I said last week. Kohelet is a very pessimistic book. If you're looking for optimism, happy-go-lucky, you're going to have to read Tehillim. You're going to have to go to David HaMelech. Shlomo and David are in two different worlds. And that, too, is part of our quest to understand the book, is to understand where Shlomo's coming from and why he's so different from David. David, Tehillim, is a very different style text. Kohelet is an extraordinarily pessimistic view, but only 3/4 of it. Meaning, and this comes back to what I said last week, we are dealing with 4 different voices in Kohelet. We're going to meet those voices in a few minutes. Only one of them represents what I would call a traditional Torah view, or the one who fears God. The other 3 are coming from 3 very different perspectives. And if 3 very different perspectives, we'll explore them, but none of them are anchored in the world of the Beit Midrash. None of them are anchored in the world of Yirat Elokim. Then, yeah, their conclusion is going to be very pessimistic. That's exactly the point.
Thank you.
All right. Let us jump in at this point. I'm going to share a screen, and we're going to start from this point forward. We're now working almost exclusively. Actually, I'm going to close the first 2 source pages because I don't need them. We'll come back to that source page in a few minutes. And we are going to jump into the text. So as I mentioned in the beginning, in order to study the text itself, the only way I can do this, especially on Zoom, is hopefully if you have a Tanakh yourself that you're comfortable with, a Tanakh with Hebrew and English, great. If not, I'm going to work off this text here. For my purposes, I'm very used to working off a Koran Tanakh for many reasons, including the fact that it gives me a kind of a visual page with the paragraphs of traditional paragraph breakdown, etc. This does not, but it does give me line by line Hebrew-English translation. So for the benefit of our purposes, this is the text we're going to work off of. Okay, I'm jumping in.
So how many times were those words?
Kohelet, excuse me?
So how many times were those words, Tov and Ra?
If you look at the source page, they're you can kind of calculate it. It's I think Tov was 68 and Ra was 46 or something like that.
Because Chochmah is 44 times.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work. But good try. All right. Divrei Kohelet ben David Melech b'Yerushalayim. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Yerushalayim. Havel havalim amar Kohelet, havel havalim akol havel, vanity, vanities. Hevel comes from the word like warm air, blow hot air. Hevel havalim. It's translated as vanities, but it essentially means worthless, nothing, air, no substance. Havel havalim, hakol havel, everything is useless, vanity. Not vanity in the modern sense of somebody who's vain, right? This is havel havalim, meaning useless. Ma yitron la'adam b'chol amalo. What does man gain from all of his labor, shi'amol tachat hashamash, that he should labor under the sun? Dor lech v'dor ba, generation comes, generation goes. Aretz l'olam amadet, earth continues forever because it just goes through one generation after another. V'zarach hashemesh, yuva hashemesh, the sun rises, the sun sets. Ve'el mekomo, actually, let me put the trap back. It's easier to read it with the trap. Ve'el mekomo sho'ef v'zareach husham, and to its place where it started, it goes to be able to shine forth again. Goes in a big circle. Holech al darom, sovev el tzafon, the wind he's referring to here, the ruach, goes to the south, it goes to the north, sovev, holech haruach, the wind just continuously goes around, v'al sevivotav shav haruach, and it continues to return to its original course. Kol hanechalim olchim al hayam, the rivers, they just run into the sea, and they run continuously. The rivers never fill. The sea is never full. El makom shenechalim olchim misham hem shavim lalachet, and then the place to where the rivers flow, they return again. In other words, the rivers flow into the oceans, and the oceans supply the rivers, and you back and forth, an endless cycle of no purpose. Kol hadvarim yigeim, these things are weary to speak of. Lo yichal ish ledaber, one cannot speak of them. Lo tisba'ayin lirot, the eye is not satisfied with seeing. Lo timaleh ozen mishmoah, the ear is not filled with hearing. We've heard it before, we hear it again, over and over again. Mashayah, sheyeh, what was will be. Mashanaseh, sheyaseh, what was will be again. There is nothing new under the sun. Oh, somebody will say, wait, this is new. It was. It was long ago. Days gone by. We don't remember the earlier generations. And the generations that will come after us also don't have anybody to remember them. Those who will come even after them. Each generation is forgotten. Does everybody see this little pay here? So just to put in perspective, if you're looking at this from a Tanakh, a single Tanakh, a current Tanakh that has the traditional breakdown of paragraphs, this is all one paragraph. And then you have this little pay here, which tells me that this is a new paragraph. Pay stands for paragraph. I think you figured that out, right? Right. Pay stands for parshia, or paragraph. And there are actually only two in all of Kohelet. There's one here, and then there's one at the end of chapter 6. And that's in a traditional Tanakh, like the current Tanakh, that tells me that this is a new paragraph. When you're looking at it line by line, it's harder to see that. But they've included that little pay here to tell me that this is a new paragraph. You can also tell that this is starting something new, because in verse 12, it starts, Ani Kohelet, Ayiti Melech Yisrael b'Yerushalayim. I, Kohelet, king of Israel in Jerusalem. So that tells me that verse 12 is a new beginning, a new introduction. And in fact, in verse 13, he starts and he's speaking in first person now. V'natati et libi lidrosh v'latur b'chokhmah. I applied my heart to seek and to search out and to understand. Ala kol asher nasa tachat hashamayim, all that was done under the heavens. Hu inyan ra. It is a evil or heavy burden natan elokim livnei ha'adam la'anot bo, that God has given man to be pained with or afflicted with. What is the wisdom, the understanding of the world? I wanted to understand it. Atati et libi, to seek, to understand, to seek out wisdom, and I saw whatever his conclusions are. So certainly Kohelet starts in chapter 12 is really the beginning of the book, verses 1 through 11, and that's what sort of where I wanted to take us today, is a introduction to the book. Kohelet has an epilogue, Kohelet has a prologue. It has a beginning, summation, and it has an ending. They're very different. And the journey in between is essentially the search of the author of Kohelet. Again, we talked about the fact that who wrote the introductory prologue and epilogue is unclear. Whether it was written by Shlomo himself, most likely it was written in one of those later stages that we talked about. But from a perspective of the text, it pulls from the text itself. And so even though it's an introduction and a summary, it's very much in line with the text of the book itself. And so we're going to look at it as a unit to itself, and a unit that kind of introduces us to the book. So for our purposes for today, we're going to look at verses 1 through 11, what we call the first introduction, Divrei Kohelet. So if we had to grade the world in the assessment of this introduction, I think we would all agree the outlook at this point is not a great one. The conclusion is pessimistic. The conclusion, he says right from the beginning, Havel Havalim, everything is of no utility, of no purpose. Havel Havalim Akol Havel. Why? Because Adam, what labor, what purpose does man have in all of his labor and all of his toil? What does he get from it? Generation comes, generation goes, the earth endures, the sun rises, the sun sets, the sun rises again, the wind goes north, south, turns around to the north again, and continuously blows. The wind blows all around. What have I gained from it? All of the rivers flow into the sea fills the rivers fill the sea. I have this endless cycle, this endless futile cycle of the all of the different aspects that he describes here. Generation cycle, generations come, generations go, the sun rises, the sun sets, the wind runs north and south, the waters flow from the river to the sea and back to the rivers again, and everything that was will be, and everything that will be will be again. And essentially there is this constant refrain of everything just moves in an endless cycle. That's his conclusion at the first introduction to the book, which is very pessimistic. On the other hand, right away in verse 12, he sends us on a quest. I wanted to understand this. How can this be? What possible meaning could there be to life if the world is just an endless cycle? And that's going to take us to the rest of the book. So we will get there, but for now, I want to understand this cycle. So if I look at the verses themselves, let's start with verse 4. I want to take a really good, careful look at verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. Because if the goal here is to reflect the futility, that's probably a better translation of the word havel, is not vanity, but futile, right? Everything's futile. Havel havalim, it's all futile and futilities. If everything is futile, has no purpose, has no goal, then why does Kohelet need to say that 4 times? What do we gain from all of this labor under the sun? Generations come, generations go, the earth endures forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun goes into its place where it rises again. The wind surrounds the earth, north, south, just blows into an endless cycle. The rivers into the sea into the rivers, into an endless cycle. And then he's going to jump back into the world of history, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I have 4 different statements that reflect the same idea, which is an odd way of describing the same message 4 times. So let's explore them for a second. If I look at them from a perspective of what they are describing, give me one word. I'm going to, there's 100 people on the call, so we're going to have to work with it in kind of a limited fashion. But one word for each of these examples. Each one of these 4 is an example of this endless cycle. And there are, in fact, 4 examples. The first is the earth itself. Dor halech v'dor ba, generations come and go, but the earth endures forever. Ve'aretz li'olam amadet. The second is the sun. V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh. The third is the water. Is the ruach, is the wind. The wind
It's not the wind, it's the seasons.
I do not agree with that. We'll get to seasons. He will get to seasons in chapter 3. We're not there yet. Here we're definitely at natural phenomenon. The sun, the earth,
the sun
the
moves
water
from north to south and back with the seasons of the year. That's how you measure a year. That's what a year is, and it's fundamental to an agricultural society.
I'm going to respectfully argue, hold that, we'll get to seasons, but for now, ruach is never used in Tanakh to describe a season. That would be an odd reference in this case. It is agriculturally connected, but I don't think it's connected to the seasons. We'll talk about what it's connected to at the end of the book. The ruach again moves in this kind of a cycle. And similarly, the rivers run into the sea, and the sea runs into the rivers. If I take out the verse if I leave for a moment the verse 3, which talks about man, and verse 9, which again or verse 7, which again talks about man, if I look just at these 4 verses, 4, 5, 6, and 7, essentially I have the aretz, the earth, the shemesh, the sun, the ruach, the wind, and the water. The water. Now, that is not an uncommon or unfamiliar pairing or sequence of 4 examples to identify the world. And if I wanted to describe the world of nature, or the physical world that we have, that we expose to, that we see in our world, then these are precisely the 4 aspects that I would identify with. Now, we're going to get a little bit into an anachronism here. We'll address it in a second. But the Greeks, for example, as early as the 8th century before the Common Era, and Shlomo HaMelech is the 10th century, so we're not so far off. So early as the 8th century before the Common Era, the Greeks used exactly these 4 elements or 4 aspects, the earth, fire, wind, and water, to describe the 4 foundational elements in which the world was created. And much of Greek philosophy from that point forward revolved around the notion of describing the physical world we live in by identifying the 4 basic elements. Up until modern science, that was the prevalent perspective. And if you wanted to describe the world of nature, you described it with these 4 elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. And that's exactly what you have in these 4 psukim. Daled is the aretz, Hey is the shemesh, or the fire, 6 is the verse 6 is the wind, and verse 7 is the water. Now, we know that from a scientific perspective, the world is much more complex, and we don't really have 4 basic elements. We have much more than 4 elements, and that these were understanding of the world up until sort of modern science, but they still correspond on some level, on some deeper level, to what has essentially been transferred into the language of modern science, is to the 4 states of nature: solid, energy, or plasma, gas, and liquid. So there is some correlation between the world of the 4 basic elements. Sefer Yetzirah builds an entire description of the story of creation. Kabbalah is based on the description of the 4 basic elements through Midrashim. I think I actually put one of them on the source page, on the second source page that I shared with you. Actually, let me pull that up again in the chat for those who need it. Copy link. That's the second source page. And these are the 4 verses that we just identified, and these are the 4 basic elements that I'm suggesting they correspond to, essentially earth, fire, wind, and water, which is from really the 8th century before the Common Era and onward was sort of the basic language of a way of describing the world. Modern science would translate them into 4 states of nature: solid, gas, liquid, and plasma. Chazal, for example, in the Medrash, talk about these 4 elements as the basic elements of creation: haaretz, hamayim, avir, ve'ha'esh. And there's there's a lot of information there, which for our purposes is going to kind of take us off into a different direction. But let's come back to the text for a second. If in fact Kohelet is essentially arguing that the world is a futile cycle, and he looks at nature and he says, here, if you took a really hard look at the way the world operates, kind of a bird's eye view, it seems to operate in cycles. And these cycles, representing the 4 states of nature or the 4 elements of nature, are continuous. And the cycle of the earth is a cycle which continues and endures forever. And the cycle of the sun or of fire is a cycle of light of creation. Like, it just continues. It goes up, it comes down, sun rises, sun sets. The wind turns around the earth. We'll see later on, he's going to talk about the cycle of the wind in terms of its role in agriculture, but in terms of planting the seeds into the world. But for now, it continues, and it just goes into an endless cycle, which seems to be futile. Similarly, the water starts in the sea, goes into the ocean, goes back into the sea. It's an endless cycle. What does it accomplish? What is the world? Right? In the language of science, if I can translate these 4 verses into modern language of science, you have in these 4 verses the law of the conservation of energy and matter. That's what you have. Nothing gets lost. Nothing gets added. The world is a constant cycle of conservation of energy and matter, and on a broad scale, nothing changes. That essentially is the question with which Kohelet begins. Now, here's the problem. He's missing one element or one dynamic in the story of creation by describing these 4 verses. He's described the world of nature perfectly. He's described the earth, he's described the sun or light, he's described the wind, he's described water. I have all the elements of nature, and they form an endless cycle. What's missing?
Humans.
Meaning of life based on these 4 verses, what's missing?
The spirit, neshama.
Man. The shama or man. Where's the world of emotions? Where's the world of desire? Where's the world of feelings? Where's the world of creativity? Where is man in this story? I've taken 4 verses that describe an endless cycle and drawn my conclusion that everything is futile because the cycle doesn't go anywhere. Well, wait a second. What about man? Where is man in this story? And the truth is that man brackets this story on both ends. In verse 3, he asks the question, Ma yitron la'adam b'chol ha'malo she'amal tachat hashamesh? What does man gain from his labor under the sun? Meaning, the question is about man. The answer is about nature. And then he jumps back into the world of man in verse 8. Things are weary, they can't be spoken, our ears can't be filled with hearing or satiated with seeing. That which was will be, that which has been done. Generations will come, they'll be forgotten. We don't remember the previous generations. Generations that come after us will be forgotten by the generations that come after them. This is all about man. So how did we jump from the world of nature in its 4 states to the world of man? And therein lies the key to understanding this introduction. And that is to see it as the 4 states of nature, or the 4 elements of nature that he describes, as a mashal, as a parable to the world of man. And in order to understand this, what I want to do is I want to take us on let's start from the basic question. Is the notion of a mashal, is the notion of a parable, a tool used in the language of Tanakh? And the answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. There are many places in Tanakh where we find actual parables where I described elements of nature as a parable to the element of man. For example, I'll give you two examples that are very simple to see. I will just run through them very quickly. One is in Yechezkel Perek Yud Zayin. Yechezkel Perek Yud Zayin, Vahi Dvar Hashem Elai Lemor. God spoke to Yechezkel saying, Ben Adam, Chud Chida. Put forth a riddle. Umishal Mashal. And speak a parable to the house of Israel. What's the parable? What's the parable? There is this great eagle with great wings and long feathers. Malonatza, full of feathers. And it has wonderful colors. And it came to the Lebanon and it clipped the top of the cedar. And it cropped off the topmost of your twigs, and it brought this cedar to the land of Canaan, in the city of merchants. And it took of the seed of the land, and he planted it in soil, and planted it over waters, and it sat over a willow tree. And it grew, and it became a vine, and it was became a spreading vine of low stature, shiflat koma, whose branches turned, and its roots were under him, and became a vine. So the great eagle, the vine bent its roots towards this great eagle and shot forth its branches towards him. And he might water it. It was planted in good soil. It goes on, a whole massive story. The question that of course, is, what is the point of all of this? So he says in verse 12, right? He tells you exactly what the point of the story is. Amorla, the Beit HaMeri. You know what this is? The king of Babylon is going to come to Yerushalayim. He's going to take its prince, he's going to take its king, and bring him to Babel. And he's going to take the seed of the kingdom, and make with it a covenant, and make it swear loyalty to it. And it will become a low kingdom and not lift itself up and not rebel against the king. But nonetheless, they're going to rebel, and that's going to be the mistake. And this entire story is an episode, it's a parable to the story of Tzidkiyahu and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the great eagle. Tzidkiyahu is the pluck of the branch that was placed in the land of Israel. Tzidkiyahu turned to Paro in order to claim loyalty to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, against the wishes of the Navi. And that's exactly what Yechezkel describes. All of this through a parable of the eagle and the tree and the sea, the sapling that was replanted, etc. It's a parable. It's a mashal. You have another example in Sefer Shoftim where Shimshon comes to the Philistines in the middle of a celebration, and he says he wants to start up with them. So he tells them, I will give you a riddle. Because he had just seen this experience. We had this lion and the carcass of the lion, and in the carcass of the lion, there's bees that had nested, and the bees started to produce honey. And so he says to them, what's the riddle? Out of the eater came forth food, from the strong came forth sweetness. Because he saw the lion, he saw the carcass, he saw the bees, and he saw the honey. And the rest of the story is not our issue. But what is our issue is to understand that the notion of a mashal is not out of the ordinary, not out of the question for a interpretation of Tanakh. And these four elements of nature could very well be each of them a mashal to the struggles, the themes, the concept of the role of man in this text. Now, let me take this one step further. It's not enough to show that the mashal, or the notion of a mashal, is relevant to Tanakh. I think it's actually relevant to Kohelet, because Kohelet himself employs the notion that nature represents in a kind of a parable or a kind of a symbolic representation the world of man. Where do we see that? I'll show you at the end of the book. I'm just going to jump for a moment to chapter 12. Okay? So I've jumped to Kohelet chapter 12. Kohelet chapter 12 it's not the epilogue. We're still in the before the epilogue, and he's talking about the process of death and the issue, the element that death has on the human being, the impact that it has. And he writes, the beginning of chapter 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, until the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Now listen to the language of the poetry. I'm going to skip the Hebrew for a second even, because you just need to hear the poetry. He's describing the process of death. This is before the sun, the light, the moon, and the stars darken, and the clouds return after the rain. When the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders shall cease because they are few, and those who look out the windows are darkened, and the doors shall be bent, shall be shut in the street, and the sound of the grinding is low, and one shall rise up at the voice of a bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. They will be afraid of heights, and terrors will be in the way. And the almond tree shall blossom, the grasshopper shall be a burden, his desire shall fail, and man goes to his everlasting home, and the mourners go into the streets. Anybody want to take a guess? What are the keepers of the house that begin to tremble in old age? Are the feet. The strong that begin to bow themselves is the spine. The grinders that cease because they are few are the teeth. The ones that look out the windows are darkened are the eyes that begin to dim in their ability to see. This is the most poetic, powerful, and frightening physical description in metaphorical terms of the process of the old age leading to death, and then leading to the decomposition in the grave. The silver cord is severed, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is broken, the wheel is broken. Finally concludes, that's the mashal. Now here's the nimshal. The dust returns to the earth as it was. The spirit returns to God who gave it. That's how the Sefer concludes, by the way. In other words, it's all a parable to man. The parable to man, the notion is that the states of nature that we're describing are, in fact, the description, different aspects of the human experience. And so that brings us back to the beginning of the Sefer, which is, if this is also a mashal, what is it a mashal to? And the answer to that question is, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait till next week, but the answer to that question is, this mashal of these four elements of nature are in fact a mashal. Through the text of the Sefer, we're going to see it inside, and mashal to the four primary personalities of the story of Kohelet. We're going to see the builder, we're going to see the philosopher, we're going to see the hedonist, and we're going to see the one who fears God, the Yirei Elokim. These are the four people who are arguing, who are debating. These are the four sides of the personality of Shlomo HaMelech, and they will correspond based on the text of the book itself, which I'll show you next week. They will correspond to each of these four elements that are identified in this introduction. Remember, I think the introduction was written later. So by taking these four elements, which the book deals with the cycle, the book deals with the struggle of each of these personalities to find meaning in the world. The builder, what is all four. If I'm going to die in the end and not be able to benefit from what I built, what is wisdom going to get me? If at the end of 120 a person is lying in the grave, then where does his wisdom accomplish? What does his wisdom accomplish for him? The hedonist, the one who enjoys the world, enjoys the moment, but the moment ends. Right? The shadow of death will haunt each of the three main personalities of the book until the Yirei Elokim comes along and says, okay, but there's a fourth answer, and we'll get to it, but that is essentially the representation in parable form in the introduction to each of these four states of nature. They represent the afar, the body that represents the builder, the shemesh, which represents the philosopher, the light of wisdom, the water, which represents the hedonist. We'll talk about how that connects, and the ruach, or spirit, which will eventually become the personality of the Yirei Elokim. So this is essentially the cast of characters, and what I'm claiming or suggesting to you is that this introduces to us the struggle, the question of each of the main personalities of the book of Kohelet. Each one is represented by a different element of these four verses. The individual who represents the shemesh, or wisdom, the individual who represents the aretz, the earth, or the one who wants to build and accomplish. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button. One who wants to accomplish and build in the world. The individual who represents the water, which is the endless cycle of pleasure and produce in the world and benefit, and eventually we'll see the ruach as well, who is the spirit of the Yirei Elokim. So more or less, that's our cast of characters. I jumped ahead a little bit just so that I kind of show you where this is going. We will, B'ezrat Hashem, next week, figure out how to link each of them to each of these four personalities and to the text, and then begin to explore, in the language of the vernacular, what is irking each one of them, who they are, and how they represent different aspects of Solomon's life story. Okay, I will stop here. What I will do is I will save the chat so I can take a look at it afterwards, and apologize for anybody.
Rabbi, it's up to you, but if you want to, if you prefer to do it afterwards, that's fine. But if you want to look at the chat now, that's also fine. Whatever works better for. I know
what do we have in the chat?
It's not so much in the chat.
Excuse me, I'm just wondering if the elements, there has to be a certain higher control. If they go havoc, I mean, they can kill human beings and send the world topsy-turvy.
So again, let's start with Solomon's dealing with a very basic level of the elements kind of representing nature. Nature
volcano
itself,
and floods and
so nature itself doesn't have a good and evil. It just is. He will explore exactly that, right? What you're describing is the perspective of man. It's from the perspective of man. If life is good and death is bad, so elements of nature that bring about death are bad. So he'll get to the question of how do I struggle with life, the meaning of what I do on a day-to-day basis, if death is a kind of a haunting shadow that hovers over all of existence, whether it's caused by nature or caused by our own eventual demise. From Solomon's perspective, it doesn't matter. It's the same question. What is it all about? If my search is for eternal existence, then finite existence is the issue. That's essentially Kohelet in a nutshell. My search is for infinite existence and infinite meaning, and yet my existence is finite. How do I balance that? So he will, at the end of the day, we know where the conclusion ends up, right? It's not hard to figure out where his conclusion ends up. His conclusion ends up that there needs to be some kind of spiritual existence that's eternal, and that's where fear of God comes in. But it's going to take him 12 chapters to get there. So we'll have to work our way through it. Okay, any other questions?
It is very depressive.
Well, so like I said,
is Eov in any way comparable?
So last week we talked a little bit about the connection between Kohelet and Eov. Eov is easier to read in the sense that it's structured more clearly. Eov is not necessarily easier to digest. Eov, on the one hand, he asks the question. Eov deals with theodicy. Eov deals specifically with the question of the righteous who suffer and the justice of God. Kohelet's address is not to the question of theodicy directly. He will ask the question. He will get to the question of theodicy. He'll say, there are righteous people who meet the fate of the wicked, and there are wicked who meet the fate of the righteous. And he'll conclude, this is futile. But that's from a vantage point of one of the three personalities speaking. We'll have to figure out who that is. What the challenge we will have is to try to figure out each chapter, who's speaking, whose perspective is being expressed. That's the challenge for us, is to figure out who is talking and then what they're saying and who they're talking to, because they're talking to each other. Right? That's part of the issue. The philosopher is talking to the hedonist is talking to the builder is talking to the philosopher. Right? They're talking to each other, and then the Yerei Elokim enters into the conversation. So we're literally recreating this conversation around which three of the personalities are going to throw up their hands and give up. And only one is going to survive till the end of the book, and that's the Yerei Elokim. So you have to stay with us till the end. If you jump out in the middle, I'll conclude with the story. My father used to tell us this little vignette all the time. About the guy who comes to the rabbi and he says that he became an apikoros. You know what an apikoros is? Or a heretic. Became an apikoros by reading the Abarbanel. How did you become an apikoros? By reading the Abarbanel. So he said, if you look at the Abarbanel's commentary on every parsha, he starts with 150 questions. And he lists the questions one after the other. Question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he addresses them, he answers them. So the guy said to the rabbi, I sat every Friday night learning Chumash. I would open up an Abarbanel after dinner, and I'd start to read all the questions. But then I would be tired. It's Friday night, and I fell asleep. So every Friday night, I only read the questions. I never got to the answers. From all the questions, I became a heretic. So my advice to you all is, hang in there. Stay with us till the end of the book, because if you jump ship in the middle, you can end up with a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. All right.
Can I ask a question? Do you have time for a question?
Sure.
Okay, the first question is a simple one. You have three items in the chat. Are they just for this lecture? I haven't had a chance to look at them. Are they just for this lecture, or are they for the lecture series in its entirety?
No, the sources were just for this lecture. There's two sources or source pages. I just repeated one. But the source pages were for today's class. We'll use one of them again next week. I will post each week. We'll post the relevant source material for that week.
Okay. And the second is really more a comment than a question. For years, I've studied Kohelet and been confused by the multiplicity of ideas. This notion that there are four voices and four different people sort of dealing with things is a fascinating one. And I think starts to immediately straighten out much of the confusion that I've had in studying this book. I think it's a fantastic idea, a brilliant kind of synthesis.
I agree with you, and I can agree with you only because it's not my novelty. This is essentially the novel approach that was first articulated many decades ago by Rav Yoel Ben Nun. Rav Meidan kind of took it and analyzed it, elaborated on it, taught it. Eventually, he wrote a summary of it in a book called Ani Kohelet, but it's a summary. It's not the full version. Rav Yoel Ben Nun himself has taken the idea slightly to a different direction, where he talks more about a choir of voices rather than a dialogue, but more or less navigating all around the same basic principle, which is that there are four identifiable philosophies in the book. And now we need to sort out who's speaking, where, when, and to whom.
Rabbi,
So
that makes one wonder whether one can really attribute this to a single source. In other words, is Solomon truly the author, or are there really a whole variety of voices going on in there, and it's been attributed to Solomon? Perhaps Solomon had some of these voices. It's hard for one person to be all of these things at once.
David, very quickly, I beg your pardon, Rabbi. Check your chat. I linked both of Rabbi Shulman's source sheets. If you can leave it up for 30 seconds, please let David download those, and anyone else, both in the very last chat. Thank you.
Also, as we pointed out earlier, they are on the program page. Even if you don't have a chat, you go to the website, they're posted on the website. So they remain up all the time.
Yeah. My answer to the question about voices versus one person is that you don't need different authors to express different views in one book. Eov has one author, and it expresses 4 different views in the book. Solomon will personally identify, and we will see this very clearly, will personally identify with each of the aspects of the personalities that he presents very clearly. The only question is this a philosophical treatise? Is he writing the dialogue? Look at the book of the Kuzari. The book of the Kuzari is a dialogue between the king of the Khazar people and Rabbi Yehuda and the Chaver, the rabbi. Was that written by 2 people? Did they sit down and write the dialogue out together? Or did one person write the dialogue from both sides? My only argument is that one person, King Solomon, is writing the dialogue. He's writing the debate. He's writing his internal struggles. But if you want to present it, if you want to think about it in terms of 4 different people, we can. But I think it's very clear that all four of them are dynamics and aspects of King Solomon, and no real person ever speaks with one voice over another exclusively. We're all kind of a mix of different personalities, but from a literature perspective, he pulls them out, separates them. We'll talk about this in more detail next week for those who have logged off. But what he does is he essentially pulls them out and creates a kind of extreme view from each one. No one of them is actually realistic because they're very extreme, but they are kind of an attempt to understand each perspective on life from a different vantage point and then pull it together. We ourselves all have aspects of all of them in us, and I think that that's what Solomon has done. So that's my answer to that question.
Well, good. It reminds me of what they said about Bacon, the philosopher, scientist, and the meanest of all men.
I'm gonna suggest that we close up here.
I can't resist with the story of the Abarbanel, which I've said, yes, it's a great story, but I'll add something, and I'm sorry, please take it with a grain of salt. Even if you read the answers to the Abarbanel, you might become an Epicurus. And I'll tell, if you know the Abarbanel's approach to many things, it's a little non-traditional, but I'll tell a cute story. Rav Schachter told us, I won't mention any name, but when YU was looking for a president in the 1970s, before Dr. Lamb was hired, so one of the other candidates, Rav Soloveitchik, I think, expressed the view that he didn't like what he said. He said something to this. So somebody said to Rav Soloveitchik, but the Abarbanel says the same thing. And Rav Soloveitchik said, I wouldn't want the Abarbanel as head of Yeshiva University either. So anyways, I'm sorry, you can ignore that. We'll take it off on the tape, but it is true. The Abarbanel, it was really... by the way, I mentioned we were just in Portugal. I know, earlier in June, the end of June, beginning of July. I mentioned this before, and they have the Lubavitch in Portugal, in Cascais, has the original manuscript of the Abarbanel from the early 1500s, and you can see the censor, where the censor censored out the Abarbanel. You see the black marks of the original censor, which all the books had to go through. But what's amazing with the Abarbanel is the censor's ink has erased, and you can see it's just very light black, and you can actually read what the Abarbanel wrote that got censored. And it was the Abarbanel complaining how the Christians attacked the Jews for no reasons, and they, doing all these terrible things to us. And the censor had taken it out. And here we are 400 years later, and you can see the original Abarbanel. So it's really, the Abarbanel was really probably the most important rabbinic figure ever to live in Lisbon. But like all great rabbinic figures, had views that were not always fit into a box. Rabbi, I hope that's okay that I threw that in. But I like the story with the questions and the answers. Yeah, don't fall asleep before the answers. Okay, thank you very much.
Have a wonderful week, everybody. Have a wonderful week.
Okay, everybody have a wonderful week. Tomorrow, Simi Peters on Sefer Yonah. Kohelet and Yonah, how else to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. And then Parshi on Thursday, and then I guess Friday morning I'll be talking on the Machzor, beginning now, moving from the Siddur to the Machzor, 9:30 Friday morning. And next week we'll be adding, we'll have a couple new classes next week too. So keep on the post, keep looking out. And of course, I mentioned a few times our September 10th Yom Iyun, Sunday morning, 8 speakers, half an hour each, 9:15 a.m. Sunday, September 10th. Jennifer, 6:15 in LA, so you don't have to worry about missing Minyan. You'll be, you'll have to learn for 2 hours before Minyan starts. And anyways, okay, please invite a friend. We'll hope to see you all soon, and everybody be well. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.